Game jams are great. If you're ever struggling to finish a project, it turns out the best way to get things done is to constrict yourself to a theme and an absurdly short deadline. About a month ago, I started work on a game for the 48-hour-long GMTK 2022 game jam with my friends Tep G and Ben. The theme for the jam ended up being somewhat restrictive, but after a lot of work and more than a few hours of lost sleep, we managed to pull through and come in 149th place overall out of 6,144 entries. So it's a safe bet to say I'm pretty proud of this game despite a few flaws and glitches that still made their way in. Through this experience and a few others, I've come up with a couple of ideas and soft rules, which I need to get better at following myself, that may or may not help you in your game jams. So jumping straight into it, tip number 1 is to actually participate. For every jam I've participated in, there's at least another one where I have sat idly and watched the timer tick down or just given up after not being able to think of an idea right away. The two major barriers I always felt when starting a jam were either just forgetting that it existed or feeling that I couldn't take advantage of the theme very well, leading to me getting bored and just quitting. So of course, to deal with the first thing, you're going to want to set some alarms and reminders 1-2 days or maybe just a few hours before the jam starts, while making sure your schedule is completely clear, outside of, necessary things of course. Sometimes life gets in the way. However, not giving up on the jam is a whole different beast. Although this may not apply to everyone, I personally find that once I've laid down some solid groundwork and worked on the project for 2 or so hours, it becomes a lot more difficult to convince myself to quit. So really, the focus should be on building momentum during the first few hours of the jam so that you can actually get started on working. One thing I found that helps with this is focusing on things you want to do before the game jam even starts. Perhaps you know in advance you want to do a 2D game with pixel art, or maybe you want to make a side-scroller. Giving yourself extra limitations to work with around the theme can actually be quite liberating, as you save yourself effort and can get to imagining the ideal version of the game you want to make in your head much quicker than if you had less to go off of. Another good way to build a sense of accountability is to invite somebody to work with you on the project. However, if you can't find anyone who's willing to work with you, then you can just tell anybody that you know, like a friend or family member, that you're going to work on the project, and that will probably work just as well. Now, the second tip kind of contributes to the first one in a way, but you never want to take too long coming up with the idea. This tip can be a little misleading, as a fun, solid idea is actually probably the most important part of your jam game, as many people value unique gameplay over 100% completely flawless polish, especially after playing potentially hundreds of games with the same generic take on the theme. I personally recommend limiting the planning to a 30-minute to 2-hour brainstorming session right after the theme is released, depending on how long the jam is. And then, no matter how much you have, just jump straight into development. I guarantee you that even if you don't have the details planned out, ideas will pop into your head as you're making and playtesting different bits of your game. Having at least something to work with in front of you makes it so much easier to come up with and test ideas, even if it's just a simple character controller in a test scene. For Entity 12, our GMTK jam game, we only spent about 3/4 of an hour brainstorming ideas and started working on implementing the one we liked best pretty much immediately with no extra planning. This idea relied upon coming up with a number of different events the dice in our game could cause, so instead of dedicating time to only thinking or filling the slots with generic power-ups like run fast, we let ideas slowly come to light while working on other parts of the game, making development much faster as not too much time was spent sitting around doing nothing. Moving on to tip number 3. Once you have your idea, make sure it is the central focus of your game. In every game jam, you see practically copy-paste entries of the same top-down shoot-'em-up or platformer with a little bit of the theme to the side. Do not do this. When adding mechanics to your game, always think about how it will interact with your central idea. For example, our game, Entity 12, has a dice that produces many environmental effects after it is rolled, sometimes harmful or helpful depending on where it is. Since the dice itself feels risky to move, we stripped the game of more challenging puzzle elements to make the levels feel a bit more maze-like, and focus on the experience of carefully navigating a space where you have to think about numerous things that could happen as a result of each move. Although, as a point of criticism to our own game, there were definitely some levels that didn't really take full advantage of this, such as one level where the dice was only used to push a pressure plate, and the player had to search for one button among many that opened the exit door, while the dice was sort of just left sitting there, all alone. It's generally a good idea to fully polish your main mechanics before even beginning to implement other content or most of your levels, as the player is going to be interacting with this element throughout pretty much your whole game, and it's the main thing they're going to be thinking about when rating your game, so it has to be good. The fourth tip is to always make time to playtest. One thing that commonly happens to me in jams is this slight overscoping. Never enough to the point where I don't finish the jam, but I always end up adding new content to the very end to the point where the game just feels a little bit rushed. I find that the biggest suspect when it comes to time sinks that end up making the game feel rushed is level design. I cannot stress enough how important it is to make your game short and sweet. Your game will end up with less bugs, more people will finish it, and overall, this one thing can actually make or break your ranking at the end of the jam. You can actually get a lot of playtesting in while doing the programming. Make sure to think about the knock-on effects of features and systems you might be implementing in order to get the easy to spot bugs out of the way first. Some games will need more playtesting than others, but for a 48-hour jam, I would leave maybe around 2 hours to playtest at the end of your jam, or maybe even 3, and I usually try to export it with just 1 hour remaining to make sure that there are no problems present in only the exported version of the game, which can occasionally happen with Unity WebGL. Also, ideally find, maybe one person unrelated to the game development to playtest your game, in order to catch bugs that you might have not even thought about. Now, my fifth tip is one that's repeated in every video of this type, but I'm gonna say it here because it's a rule that somehow I always find a way to forget at the most important moments, and that's just to not overwhelm the player in any way. Whether it's a complicated main mechanic or some kind of sharp difficulty curve, it's always important to ease the player into your experience, as a lot of people who play your game may not have the same experience with the genre as you do. Since you're going to be better at your own game, a good rule of thumb is to make levels that are actually a little boring to you. Not bad levels, but something milder than what you are capable of. In my opinion, the best way to do this is to put small snippets of text into the game world. It sounds similar to what I just told you not to do, but actually putting instructions in the game itself makes a world of difference. And for the love of God, never ever make the player read your game description to understand it, as most people never even look at your game page, and it will really ruin their experience with your game. It's also quite important to not only make the game easy to understand, but also to not drag it on for too long, so that the player is more likely to come away from your game with a sense of accomplishment and subconsciously rate it a bit higher. This doesn't just mean make a short game, but also make it very forgiving to the player. Add lots of checkpoints so that they don't have to repeat a lot of content, get bored, and then click off your game. I am very guilty of not following these rules. The jam release version of NTT12 had 15 levels and a checkpoint only every 5, which was a big problem when we only gave the player 3 lives and healing was based completely on luck. Trust me, the most frustrating thing is realizing at the last second that due to a lack of proper playtesting or bad design decisions, that while most people really enjoy the main mechanic and presentation of your game, it was just too frustrating for them to finish it, and that your rating could have been much higher if you just changed the number of the code. The last piece of advice that I'm going to give is about taking breaks and managing your mental game. Even for really short game jams, not sleeping is just not an option. You can get away with only 4 hours of sleep every day for a few days if you're doing a short jam and you're willing to sacrifice some energy afterwards, but don't forgo it at all, as having no rest will really slow you down as you start making more mistakes, having to go back and fix them, and just getting general brain fog. You can do whatever you want in this time. Grab lunch, scroll Twitter, or watch an episode of some series. But as long as you spend some small chunks of time away from your game every so often, ideas and energy will flow to you much quicker. It's a bit deeper than that though. Outside of sleep, it's generally a good idea to have 1 or 2 30 to 60 minute breaks each day. When people say that your brain works on problems in the background, it's really true, and keeping that fresh perspective on your game can keep you and your team enthusiastic, but also help you make better design decisions in the end. In fact, I recommend something like this for almost any work you do. It's a tried and true way of avoiding burnout and keeping yourself motivated. Plus, you're going to need that time to eat and take care of yourself anyway, so why not just spend it away from the game? Since most people work on game jams in teams, I want to give a little bit of team-specific advice here as well. I recommend limiting your team to around 4 to 5 members, and you should ideally all be doing separate things. If you have a mishmash of work from various different artists or composers, it will be obvious. And collaborating on code can be very hard work, especially if you have to modify each other's work. It's definitely possible to have multiple team members doing the same things. Pixel art games are a very good way to keep art consistent, and as long as programmers work on separate parts of the game, there really shouldn't be no problems between them. However, the hard truth is that sometimes you're just going to have to step outside your comfort zone and do something that you're not used to in order to make sure you're not stepping on each other's toes throughout the jam. But even though you're doing separate tasks, make sure to still communicate to each other about what you want to do and what is still left to do. Now, for this, most people use Trello boards, and while I would 100% recommend having one, especially if you don't know your team members very well, you also don't want to tie yourself down to it, as constantly managing cards can really weigh down on your flow and sometimes limit your creativity. If you suddenly come up with some idea or small bit of polish that you want to implement, it's often better to just get started on it right away, as long as you understand what you're doing and your team members are on board. In my experience, a lot more gets done when you just follow your instincts, especially if you have some experience with jams already. For this style of work, I'd recommend collaborating with people you know or have worked with in the past, as you'll just understand each other and get on without having to manage yourselves all the time. And for those that don't have a team, there are tools that can supplement areas that you lack. If you have no programmer, engines such as Unity, Godot, and GameMaker all have competent visual scripting solutions, although I do understand that not having a programmer in your team is probably the hardest way to do a game jam. If you have no artist, you can find a small color palette online and use size changes and stretching through code in place of animations to create a look of intentional minimalism in your art. If you have nobody who can do sound effects, then the program that I use for sound effects is Elabcha, and it comes with a variety of presets that should fit most games made for jams. And if you have no composers, don't worry, as music is not the most important part of jam games, and you generally will not be judged for not having it if your SFX design and game feel can make up for it. If your game is one of those games that really needs music to intensify action or paint some atmosphere, there are many royalty-free websites that contain hundreds of sounds and tracks which may not be the best, but get the job done. Now, because some tips are too short for their own points, I'm going to finish this video off with a
lightning round.
For impact, never underestimate screen shake, but save it for the most relevant events in your game in order to not overstimulate the player. Don't be afraid to throw away ideas even after implementing them. While laser focus on one concept can be very good for productivity, it doesn't always make the most fun game, so take some time to think about things from the neutral perspective of the player. If your jam is being hosted on itch.io, then save icons, backgrounds, and writing descriptions for a game page for after the jam submission period is over, as itch still lets you change all these even after the jam has ended and there are more important things that you need to be doing during the jam period. Make sure that most actions the player takes have feedback to them. Whether it's an animation, sound effect, or screen shake, make sure that the player knows what they're doing or should be doing at any given moment. Rate a lot of other games, and make sure to leave comments with criticism, not only to get other people to play your game, but also to help others and further your own understanding of game design by analysing it with words. Lastly, don't worry too much about your final standing in the jam. The experience you have gained, and hopefully the fun time you've had making the game, cannot be taken away by a number on your screen. What you can learn during a game jam is infinitely more valuable than what you can get with a higher score, even free official GMTK merchandise. So take criticism well, and maybe even polish your game up a bit after the jam if you feel like it. Overall, game jams are really valuable events to take part in, and are the starting point in a long journey of game development for a lot of people. I hope this video helped some people prepare for their next big jam, or overall made their experience more fun. And if you're interested, you could also check out the game we made that inspired this video, Entity 12, on itch.io. So goodbye, and I hope to see some really good jam games.